Kalen Dre was never meant to be on Calestis Station. A last-minute reassignment had pulled him from recovery leave and dropped him onto the diplomatic platform, orbiting the contested neutral zone between the Alari Dominion and the unified human colonies. His orders were simple: supplement the human security detachment for the high-stakes peace negotiations. But the simplicity ended there. The Alari were unlike any species he'd trained for, elegant and immense, with bioluminescent skin that pulsed with emotion and complex rituals woven into every movement. He'd read the briefing files, studied the protocols, memorized the taboos. But no simulation had prepared him for the sheer presence of an Alari dignitary in motion. He'd barely stepped off the docking bay when he felt eyes on him, curious, critical, silent. The humans on station were deferential, strained by the weight of political expectations. The Alari watched with something colder. He was aware keenly of his uniform clashing with their flowing symbiotic silk attire, of his pulse racing in a corridor designed for beings taller, quieter, older than him. And when the Alari ambassador arrived, the already taut atmosphere vibrated like a tuning fork. Ambassador Solari of the Alari moved through the ceremonial arch of the reception hall with effortless gravitas. Her frame shimmered with subtle motion, like stars moving beneath translucent skin. Kalen had seen images, but reality held more danger, more beauty, more distraction. She greeted the human ambassador with musical resonance, her voice echoing not through sound, but through some resonant field that pressed lightly against the bones. Every Alari around her pulsed in sympathetic rhythm. Guards aids the towering security director Zareth, who never once blinked. Kalen held back, eyes scanning. His job wasn't to admire. He was the only one on the human team with advanced cross-species threat recognition certification, an oddity that had seen him deployed from burned-out colonies to high-risk negotiations. He noticed movement in the upper balconies, subtle but wrong. A figure in clothing unsuited to either faction. Then another crouched in shadow, assembling something. And then confirmation, a weapon glinting against the arched crystal panels that decorated the ceremonial ceiling. Instinct overrode protocol. Kalen broke formation, sprinted across the buffer zone. No human was allowed to enter unbidden, and collided with the ambassador just as the first pulse detonation erupted. The blast shattered the decorative canopy, crystalline shards raining down where Solari had stood moments before. Kalen felt the sting of shrapnel along his shoulder, but held his body over hers, shielded her form with his own. She struggled beneath him, offended by contact, unaware of the second explosion seconds away. He rolled them behind a support column, pain blossoming as a splinter of steel embedded in his side. 3 assailants. 2 north, 1 east. He relayed the report over his comm voice, tight but even. The human security commander barked orders. The Alari team's pristine in ceremony floundered under fire. Kalen spotted a shooter repositioning for a clean sightline to their hiding place. He pulled his sidearm and issued instructions, not waiting for agreement. When he moved, Solari followed. The corridor was chaos-broken decor. Panicked diplomats, alarms blaring. 2 more attackers burst from cover. Kalen pushed Solari behind a collapsed table, took cover, assessed. 1 assailant called out in accented standard, insisting he step aside, that it wasn't his fight. His answer was clean: mechanical, disable the weapon arm, intercept the charge, redirect force. He fought with brutal precision, not out of anger, but necessity. Pressure points, joint leverage, anatomy learned from bloodied manuals and painful practice. He knew where Alari bones were weakest, where their oxygen conversion organs pulsed near the surface. He dropped the last attacker with a calculated strike to the neck, watching the body crumple without killing. Solari stared at him with a look that defied translation. He scanned her for injury. None. Just disbelief. The emergency room was sealed behind them with seconds to spare. Zareth, her chief of security, was still in the main hall, issuing delayed orders, explaining failure in hushed tones. Solari had not spoken since the table shielded her. Now, behind reinforced alloy doors, she turned to Kalen and asked his name. Not for record, but for memory. The council convened 12 hours later. Voices clashed in polished chambers high above the nebula-wrapped curve of the station. Accusations flared. Protocols had been breached. Diplomatic lines crossed. A human had touched an Alari ambassador, thrown her to the ground, pressed his body against hers. but she interrupted the shouting. She, who had been silent, now held the room with her voice. The attack had been deliberate, coordinated. She acknowledged that their security, both human and Ilari, had failed to detect it. Kalen Dre had not. His response had been immediate, precise, effective. She would not dismiss that. She would not pretend his presence had not saved her life. She invoked her right under Diplomatic Clause 17, a rarely used privilege. She would select her own protector. She named Kalen Dre. Shock rippled through the chamber. The Ilari advisors recoiled. Her human counterparts struggled for words. Kalen remained stone-faced, though inside something cracked. He knew what the assignment meant. Proximity, constant presence, violation of barriers that had kept species apart for generations. It was the kind of choice that sparked wars disguised as policy corrections. She faced him and asked if he objected. The question was a test, not an invitation. He answered as a soldier answers. He served where needed. The meeting adjourned in a storm of discontent. His superior pulled him aside, warned him of boundaries, told him to tread with care. Touch, glance, proximity, any of it could end his career. Or worse. But Kalen had seen the gaps in the station's defenses. He had felt the betrayal of response teams arriving late. He had seen Zareth react not like a commander, but like a man stunned that someone else had interfered. That evening, summoned to Solari's private suite, Kalen entered a space not meant for human senses. The air was denser, warmer, subtly charged with electrical trace compounds that interacted with Ilari biochemistry. Botanical constructs hovered in silent suspension. Lights pulsed not from bulbs, but from breathing photosynthetic filaments growing out of walls. She entered soundlessly. He did not move. She circled him, studied him, asked if he was uncomfortable. He replied that his training covered Ilari atmospherics, that he had studied interspecies physiology in depth. She asked how deeply. He said only that it was his specialty. She didn't push, but her expression said she had cataloged his answer. She told him their standard security practices were insufficient. Someone wanted her dead, someone with access. Until that changed, she needed him closer than tradition allowed, closer than comfort permitted. He did not step back when she crossed the distance between them. She paused inches away, observing, calculating, perhaps daring him to flinch. He did not. That night, they reviewed the plans for the upcoming cultural exchange ceremony. Kalen restructured the entire security plan, redirecting routes, removing redundancies that created timing gaps, shifting patrol rotations. She approved all of it with silent nods, watching not the plans but him. And beneath every decision, a tension threaded itself. Not romantic, not yet, but undeniable. A current pulled by survival, shaped by danger, tempered by need. It was not attraction. It was alliance born in blood, in pressure, in shared solitude. By morning, the diplomatic rules had changed. Not in words, but in practice. No memo declared it. But everyone on Kaelestis station understood the ambassador now walked with a shadow not of her world, and it was not unwelcome. Kaelestis station shimmered with ceremonial grandeur as the cultural reception commenced. Floating bioluminescent spheres pulsed overhead, casting kaleidoscopic reflections against the crystal walls of the grand atrium. Representatives from 12 starfaring civilizations mingled beneath the transparent dome, their movements choreographed with the precision of a diplomatic ballet. At the center of this tapestry stood Ambassador Silari, now flanked not by a traditional Ilari honor guard, but by a solitary human protector. Kalen Dre remained precisely 3 paces behind her, never too close to breach decorum, yet near enough to intercept any threat within a heartbeat. His eyes swept the crowd, never resting, cataloging anomalies, movement patterns, visual cues, unscheduled arrivals. He was not dressed for ceremony. He wore reinforced duty armor beneath his formal exterior, every motion practiced, silent, efficient. The room thrummed with suspicion. Some delegations approached Solari with warmth, recognizing her as the progressive voice of a changing generation. Others, particularly among the conservative factions of the Ilari Dominion, radiated tension with every step. When they confronted her cloaked in veiled tradition and rigid doctrine, they spoke of sacred tenets of ancestral vows forbidding concessions she now entertained. She countered not with defiance, but with mastery, invoking deeper layers of cultural law that those challengers had not anticipated. And when their postures stiffened with embarrassment, it was Kalen who moved subtly a calculated half-step forward to remind them he was watching. That they were not alone with her. The ripple that followed was enough. They withdrew, not defeated, but delayed. Later, in a quiet sector of the atrium, Solari glanced over her shoulder, not to summon him, but to study him. There was something in her gaze no human dictionary could translate, part curiosity, part gratitude, part wariness. She addressed him not as a servant, but as a question, her thoughts unspoken, yet potent. Kalen remained still. The armor he wore externally mirrored the distance he maintained internally. But even he could not deny what he had begun to feel, a growing unease, not at her presence, but at the increasing danger that surrounded it. The station's surveillance logs had begun to show irregularities. Medical shipments were altered, access logs tampered with. Names of crew members didn't match their biometric tags. And worse, security zones, once thought secure, now held blind spots no official schedule accounted for. His instincts spoke louder than any protocol. The attempt on Solari's life had not been an isolated act. It had been the opening move in a game yet unfinished. That night, after escorting her back to her quarters, he reviewed the attack footage from 12 angles, frame by frame, timing sequences, reaction windows. The attackers had known exactly when the security patrols would rotate. They'd timed their infiltration with a 3-second precision gap, the kind of knowledge accessible only from internal systems. Someone with high-level clearance had provided that information. Someone on the inside. The next morning, he retrieved the manifest for the station's medical inventory. Dozens of standard entries aligned, but a cluster of controlled substances didn't. Specifically, neuroinhibitors, fatal to Alari physiology, but harmless to humans. The dosage volume suggested premeditation, not error. Discrepancies in the approval chain raised deeper flags. Verification seals didn't match encryption records. The sabotage wasn't just physical, it was bureaucratic, layered behind falsified logs and duplicated clearances. He considered the implications. If Solari were assassinated using compounds lethal only to her species, and the source appeared to be human, in origin, the treaty would dissolve within hours. Hostilities could reignite. Worlds would burn. And all of it would look like a tragedy of misplaced trust. As he presented the findings to Solari in the privacy of her chamber, she listened in silence. She did not ask where he had obtained the files. She did not question his analysis. Instead, she studied the list of names on the clearance roster, eyes narrowing as patterns emerged. Many were aides officers and coordinators she had known for years. He saw it in her expression, the fracture of certainty. The realization that her inner circle might already be compromised. That the betrayal wasn't only theoretical, it was intimate, close, trusted. She asked him what he believed. He answered with action, showing her the path of access, the forged signatures, the intercepted routing. And she understood. This wasn't about one failed assassination attempt. This was a systemic dismantling of the peace effort built quietly, patiently, from within both factions. When he asked why this treaty mattered to her so deeply, she responded not with political reasoning, but with a revelation she had shared with no one. Her lineage, carefully curated for Alari political optics, was not what the Dominion believed. Her family had been lost in the border war 2 decades ago. She had been rescued, raised in a human colony, embedded in their customs until the Alari recovered her. Her existence straddled both worlds. Her very identity was the embodiment of coexistence, and also its greatest threat if discovered. Kalen understood then that their alliance was not strategic, it was necessary. She had risked everything to broker this peace, not just for nations, but for herself. Her survival, her truth, her future depended on this fragile agreement. And now it was under siege. The bond between them shifted that night, not in word or gesture, but in silence. In the way her hand paused too long on the report he handed her. In the way she remained near as he reviewed the surveillance loops one last time. In the way neither of them stepped away when proximity blurred protocol. It wasn't affection yet. It was something deeper. The fusion of isolation, purpose, and trust forged in the crucible of conspiracy. When Kalen returned to his own quarters, he found a transmission waiting from a lower-ranking officer, Chen, one of the few station personnel he still trusted. She had discovered inconsistencies in the cargo manifest and flagged them quietly. Kalen cross-referenced the timestamps. The anomalies coincided with periods when the Alari director of security, Zareth, was recorded as off-station, yet surveillance footage from a lower deck showed a figure matching his profile accessing a restricted panel. The clarity of the footage was poor but not beyond enhancement. Facial recognition confirmed the worst. Zareth had never left. He had hidden in plain sight, cloaked in shadows, manipulating systems from behind the veil. Kalen deactivated all outbound signals in his suite. He encrypted the footage and stored it on a secure, isolated drive. The implications were catastrophic. If Zareth was involved, the corruption extended into the highest tiers of Alari command. And given the precision of the sabotage, it was unlikely he acted alone. He returned to Solari immediately, careful to avoid surveillance channels, using maintenance tunnels and forgotten service corridors. When she opened the private chamber to him, her expression said she already knew the risk of his arrival. She listened to the evidence without blinking. Her reaction was not fear, but grim resolve. Trust had become a liability. Everyone around them could be compromised. They could report it, of course, to Human Command, to Alari High Council. But both systems had already failed to catch the threat. The network of betrayal was too embedded, too protected. What they needed was undeniable proof evidence that couldn't be buried or reframed. As they stood together in the artificial dawn of the Alari biohabitat, surrounded by glowing flora and the low hum of interstellar wind generators, they knew their position had changed forever. They were no longer diplomat and protector. They were now fugitives within the system, potential enemies of both their own people. The only way forward would be through deception. They would stage a public disagreement, create distance, feign division. Meanwhile, in secret, they would work to unravel the conspiracy from within. The next steps would be perilous, but neither hesitated. They had crossed the invisible line between loyalty and survival, between duty and something more dangerous, mutual faith. The forbidden link had been forged. The outer rings of Calestis Station housed the least regulated access corridors designed long ago for maintenance crews and emergency rerouting, now forgotten arteries that offered secrecy to those who knew them. Kalen and Solari moved through these narrow passageways in silence, guided by instinct and urgency. Every panel they passed hummed with hidden circuits, each turn a calculated risk. The walls themselves seemed to press inward, bearing witness to secrets never meant to surface. Outside their protected bubble, the station resumed its rhythm. The negotiations continued. Ceremonies proceeded. Appearances were maintained. But beneath the surface, the cracks widened. Security logs began disappearing from servers. Backup files showed deletion timestamps masked beneath false credentials. Surveillance arrays looped at critical junctions. It became clear this conspiracy was not a rogue operation. It had institutional support designed with surgical precision to collapse diplomatic progress under the illusion of chaos. In a secured alcove devoid of monitors, Kalen replayed the enhanced footage from the cargo bay. The face of Zareth, the Alari security director, was unmistakable. His presence in restricted zones he was never assigned to, coupled with the diverted medical supplies, connected the threads too neatly. The sabotage was deliberate. The attempt on Silari's life was not the culmination, it had been the beginning. A warning. The next attack would be definitive. Silari absorbed the evidence with grave intensity. She did not express surprise. Trust had become a distant luxury. She began listing names, not in accusation, but in recognition. People close to her familiar faces, now cloaked in suspicion. Her aide, once a companion through countless campaigns. Her ceremonial steward entrusted with encrypted diplomatic messages. Each name added weight to the truth they already carried. Betrayal had germinated inside the garden. They prepared contingencies. Kalen configured his tactical suite to operate independent of station systems. He forged new access routes using abandoned network protocols buried in old colonial subroutines. Solari encrypted their findings in quantum-fragmented segments stored across secure nodes within both Alari and human diplomatic channels. They built a data package so compelling in its breadth it could not be ignored. But the challenge remained. No one within their respective command structures could be trusted to receive it. Their plan took shape under the soft glow of emergency lighting. They would transmit the evidence through the secure communications hub located deep within the administrative sector, normally accessible only during high-level crises. But with access compromised on multiple decks, their window was shrinking. If they hesitated, the systems might fall entirely under conspiratorial control. Worse still, the message could be intercepted, reframed, or buried before it reached those capable of responding. They needed an ally, someone with institutional authority but no entanglement in the security apparatus. Kalen identified one name, a human envoy known for her resistance to Solari's methods, but whose opposition had always been transparent. Her integrity, though grating at times, had remained consistent. In a quiet corner of the station, beneath malfunctioning gravity panels, the ambassador agreed to hear them out. Upon review of the evidence, her skepticism transformed into fury. She understood instantly the consequences of exposure. The treaty would either solidify through revelation or fracture under political fallout. But she agreed to help. Moments later, the station trembled. Alarms blared through the corridors as artificial gravity fluctuated, tearing alignment gyros from their sockets. Emergency seals activated. Lights flickered and dimmed. The sabotage had begun. The conspirators had detected their signal before it launched. There would be no second chance. In the chaos, a jagged panel ripped free from a service wall and struck Kalen across the arm. Blood welled from the wound, dark and heavy. Solari caught him as he staggered, pressing her palm to his chest, steadying him. For a breathless instant, they stood pressed together amidst the sirens and flashing emergency lights, the boundaries between them as broken as the walls around them. They fled through smoke-filled service corridors, each junction harder to navigate, each stairwell a gauntlet. Kalen's wound deepened with exertion, the makeshift bandage already soaked through. The trail of blood marked their path, a risk he accepted. His focus narrowed to one goal: protect Solari at all costs. They reached a sealed bulkhead. Kalen attempted to override the manual release, forcing the mechanism open through sheer strength. The hydraulics groaned, but the pain in his arm overwhelmed him. He faltered, slumping against the wall, breath shallow. Solari moved without hesitation, guiding him away from the failing door, whispering no words but conveying everything through the fire in her eyes. They heard footsteps. Alari voices echoed down the corridor, calm but calculated. Leading them was the voice of Solari's own advisor, once considered her most loyal steward. His words carried false comfort, promising safety, requesting their location. But Solari's expression darkened. She motioned for silence. The betrayal had a name, now a face. Trust, even among those once closest, no longer existed. They waited until the search party passed, then slipped deeper into a maintenance chamber carved into the station's original infrastructure, an area untouched since the station's earliest cycles. There, amidst dust-covered storage crates and disconnected power cores, Solari treated his wound. Her movements were efficient, her focus unflinching. As she cleaned the blood and sealed the gash with salvaged medical supplies, the silence between them grew thick with meaning. His body bore the cost of her survival. The blood spilled wasn't just consequence, it was choice. In her culture, the act of bleeding for another carried meaning far beyond physical sacrifice. To offer one's body in protection, especially without obligation, was an act of sacred trust. As she wrapped the final bandage and remained seated beside him, she explained not through words, but through closeness. Her presence didn't retreat. Her hand remained over his arm long after the treatment was complete. That night, in the silence of exile, they didn't speak of politics or protocol. They didn't name the bond growing between them. They only acknowledged it in action, in the way her head rested eventually against his shoulder, in the way his arm encircled her without thought, in the way neither flinched at the impossibility of it all. In the station's failing systems, with allies turned enemies, and time collapsing around them, they found not safety, but clarity. Their connection, forged through survival, no longer resembled the duties they were assigned. It had become something personal, intimate, unbreakable. They did not sleep. There was no time. But as Kalen kept watch through the broken viewport with Solari beside him in silence, he understood fully for the first time that he was no longer protecting an ambassador. He was protecting someone he could not afford to lose. The dawn cycle brought no reprieve. The station's environmental systems stuttered under the weight of sabotage, and the corridors twisted with flickering light and stale recycled air. Kalen moved like a shadow. His steps measured despite the deepening wound in his thigh. Solari kept pace, her form cloaked in silence, her presence like a second pulse against his own. Every turn they took brought them closer to the core of the danger, and farther from the protections of diplomacy or command. They descended toward the communications hub, hidden deep within the station's central architecture, a room accessible only by diplomatic clearance and emergency override. Their goal was clear: transmit the full dossier unredacted and irreversibly public to the governments of both species. It was their only hope. The evidence they carried, access log supply, falsifications, the manifest of toxins, and the security footage of Zareth had the power to shift the balance not only of the peace talks, but of the fragile interstellar alliance itself. 2 guards blocked the main entrance, one Alari, one human. Their synchronized movements confirmed what Kalen already feared: the conspiracy extended across species, stitched together by those who benefited from endless war. He considered strategies. A firefight would alert the rest. A bluff was impossible. His face now marked on internal security as traitor and kidnapper. The only option lay above. Solari led them to an auxiliary panel, an access vent rarely used, suspended above the communications deck. They crawled through the confined ductwork in silence, the glow of emergency lighting casting long, warped shadows across their faces. When they reached the grate above the hub, only one technician remained inside, distracted by system alerts. Kalen signaled without sound. They dropped together, precise and swift. The technician crumpled unconscious. Solari sealed the entrance. Time collapsed into urgency. Kalen worked the interface, bypassing station firewalls with embedded military codes, while Solari extracted the fragmented data. Together, they assembled the transmission, a digital autopsy of the attempted political murder. He encoded the message with hybrid redundancy, targeting both Alari High Command and the Colonial Unity Council. Once sent, it could not be recalled. As the data streamed toward transmission, the tension inside the room twisted into something tighter. Solari stood behind him, her hands no longer folded in ambassadorial restraint. The proximity between them had shed the skin of diplomacy, and what remained was raw, familiar, shared, no longer defined by roles or rituals. The moment expanded. His mind still calculated threats, escape vectors, patrol routes, but his breath caught when her presence moved closer, when the space between protector and protected ceased to exist. She reached for him, not in fear, but in knowing. Not because she needed shelter, but because she had chosen it. What had begun in duty and survival now reshaped itself into something unspoken and final. Their bodies met without hesitation. It was not the fire of impulse, but the depth of convergence. 2 beings drawn together not by attraction alone, but by the accumulation of trust, pain, and the refusal to surrender. His skin carried her touch like heat, his blood already given his loyalty, no longer bounded by chain of command. Her form answered his with quiet intensity, as if their differences in anatomy were not obstacles, but invitations. No word passed between them. There was no confession, no need for language. In the dim light of the sealed hub, they moved as if the galaxy outside had ceased spinning. Each gesture deliberate, each connection sacred. Their union became the final violation of every protocol that had once defined them, and also the most honest act either had ever made. Afterward, the silence felt changed, softer. The weight of the past days still hung over them, but its shape had altered. She rested beside him briefly, her breath a steady rhythm against his chest. In her culture, the offering of blood created a bond. The offering of body afterward made it unbreakable. He understood now what it meant. And though his own people would call it misconduct, court-martial betrayal, he did not care. What had been forged between them transcended their respective codes. He rose first, pain biting beneath the bandage, and dressed in silence. The interface console flashed red. The transmission had been intercepted. Warning alarms split the air. Station lockdown protocols activated. Security had traced the origin of the data packet, and they were converging. There was no time for deliberation. They moved without words, fleeing into the lower decks. Sirens echoed down the passageways and internal barriers began to seal in sequence behind them. Their cover was blown. What little advantage they had vanished. The betrayal had anticipated this path. They reached a junction and paused beneath the dim flicker of emergency lighting. Kalen's hand found Solari's without thought. Their plan could no longer hold not together. If they remained a pair, both would be captured. The only way forward was separation. He laid out the strategy as if it were another tactical maneuver. She would return to the diplomatic wing under the guise of escape, claim abduction, reinforce the enemy's narrative. Meanwhile, he would breach the security core, extract the final access logs, and force a station-wide transmission of full unfiltered exposure of the conspiracy to every system and terminal on board. It was dangerous, reckless, possibly fatal. Her expression cracked only slightly. She did not resist the plan, but her silence held 1,000 meanings. They both knew this might be their final moment, their final breath shared. He memorized the weight of her gaze. She memorized the shape of his restraint. Then they turned and ran in opposite directions. Kalen's path led him through abandoned mechanical corridors, shadows painting the walls with fractured shapes. At a checkpoint near the core, he encountered a familiar face, Chen, one of the last human officers he trusted. Her weapon raised her expression caught between duty and disbelief. His name sat heavy on her lips, weighed by the alerts in her system tagging him as a fugitive. But he did not flinch. He offered her the data drive, the raw evidence. She took it. Her decision, like his, hung in the balance of a breath. She lowered the weapon. Together, they moved toward the security nexus. The entrance was guarded by a mix of Alari and human operatives, 4 in total. Kalen assessed their positions. A frontal approach would fail. He remembered the ventilation shaft above. He signaled Chen to create a diversion. As the alarms flared from her direction, he slipped into the shaft and descended with silent precision, disabling one guard before the others returned. Within seconds, the room turned into chaos. Energy bolts scorched the walls. Kalen took cover behind the terminal, blood seeping from a reopened wound on his leg. The pain sharpened his focus. The final access logs glowed on the screen, Zareth's command orders, sabotage instructions, and sealed council endorsements. The download raced toward completion, 78%, 92%, 100%. He triggered the override and launched the broadcast. The conspiracy unfolded across every screen on the station. Names, images, coordinates. It could no longer be contained. Zareth's second-in-command burst through the door with 2 guards. The firefight was brief, brutal. Kalen fought like a man beyond orders. Not clean, not protocol. Pure instinct and intention. When it ended, only silence remained. Chen entered behind him. The security net was collapsing, but the truth was free. And across the station, Solari was safe. She had returned to the command center under the escort of the only ambassador who had believed them. When Kalen staggered through the door moments later, bloodied and breathless, her eyes were the first to find his. She stood beneath a diplomatic seal, her expression unreadable, her posture perfect. But her gaze held only one thing: relief. The room swelled with officials' accusations, reviews, but the momentum had changed. The truth had torn through the facade. The treaty would survive. The darkness had failed to bury the light. And in the center of it all, bruised and scarred but unbroken, stood 2 individuals who had rewritten not only protocol but each other. The aftermath unfolded not in silence, but in the hum of control centers, alive with consequence. The central chamber of KLS's station pulsed with high-frequency signals, layered data requests, and diplomatic cries for clarification. Screens lit with names, now tainted officers, once respected aides, once trusted council members, once inviolate. The conspiracy had been deeper than feared, spanning both governments, rooted in those who profited from division, nurtured in the shadows cast by peace. But exposure was a scalpel. The truth, when revealed not in whispers, but in system-wide transmissions, held a gravity that even the most entrenched political machines could not ignore. The footage of Zareth's covert sabotage, the medical supply diversions, the falsified security clearances. The timing data aligned perfectly with known diplomatic movements. No amount of revisionism could dismiss what had been broadcast to every terminal on the station and archived in off-site servers before any countermeasure could be issued. Both governments reeled. Emergency sessions convened in parallel across worlds light years apart. Initial outrage gave way to uneasy acknowledgement. Some denied, others deflected, but most at last investigated. Inside the station, those implicated were detained. Zareth himself was transported under heavy guard to an off-station secure facility. His silence was unbroken, but his actions had already spoken enough. Others followed humans and Alari alike. Some furious others defeated their ambitions turned to ash under the weight of their exposure. In the command center, Kalen stood behind the delegation lines. His uniform stained his rank uncertain. Protocol dictated that he be confined, questioned, reviewed. His violation of diplomatic standards was undeniable. His physical intimacy with an ambassador unforgivable under normal circumstances. But protocol now bent beneath the greater weight of survival. The human ambassador approached first. Her voice, once laced with skepticism, now carried an edge of reluctant respect. She acknowledged his actions had preserved not only a life but a fragile balance that had stood on the edge of annihilation. Behind her, council representatives gave no nods, offered no thanks, but they did not demand punishment. That from men like them was the closest thing to absolution. Then Solari stepped forward. She moved with the same grace she had always wielded, but something in her presence had changed. It was not just survival that shone from her now, it was command. Her role had shifted. She had been a diplomat. Now she was a symbol. Her voice was steady, unwavering. She stood not as a witness, but as a pillar. When she spoke Kalen's name, she did so with gravity. She gave her account in full detail. She confirmed his actions. She described the breach not as insubordination, but as necessity. She used her authority to request clemency. But more than that, she spoke of what he had done beyond duty, of what he had given, his blood, his trust, his silence when it would have been easier to speak, his restraint when the rules had demanded abandonment. The review board recessed. When they returned, their ruling was precise. A formal review would proceed, but the ambassador's testimony would be central to any outcome. No immediate disciplinary action would be taken. His clearance remained suspended. His rank was reduced, but he was reassigned to remain at the ambassador's side under diplomatic protection, not as a soldier, but as a liaison. The treaty signing resumed 2 days later under heightened security and public scrutiny. The ceremony was subdued. Gone were the flourishes of celebration. In their place stood clarity and weight. Each signature carried not just the hope of cooperation, but the price of nearly losing it. Delegates from both species signed with hands that had trembled in past wars. And when it was done and the flags lowered and the anthem echoes faded, it was over. Kalen stood at the edge of the hall, still marked by bandages beneath his tailored uniform. He was no longer the man who had first stepped onto Kalesta's station. He was not the model soldier, not the perfect guardian. He was something else now, something outside the system he had once believed immovable. Solari found him after the ceremony ended, not in the public chambers, not amid the gathered guests, but in a quiet corridor bathed in soft blue station light. Her robes no longer bore the insignia of the Dominion. Instead, they merged human styling and Alari tradition, her own declaration of what came next. She stood before him, and the space between them hummed with everything they had become. He was no longer her bodyguard. She was no longer his charge. Their roles had ended. What remained was the choice. In her culture, a bond formed by blood and trust was permanent. It defied titles. It ignored political tides. But she understood that for him, the risk remained. His people did not see sacred vows in shared wounds. They saw infractions, breaches, scandal. He would pay a price, however quiet, for what they had become. But when she told him she had requested permanent reassignment to human space as liaison, as bridge, he understood what it meant. She would not let this moment dissolve into silence. She would stand on the edge of two worlds and call it home. He asked her nothing. She asked him for nothing in return. They simply stepped closer. Her fingers brushed his hand. The contact was soft but final. They had walked through fire, bled in corridors, broken rules that had lasted for centuries. Now finally, they were no longer looking over their shoulders. 6 months later, Kalen stood on the balcony of an outpost world orbiting a quiet red star. The air was crisp, touched with the sharp tang of distant autumn. Below, the valley stretched with early settlements and multicolored banners representing both species. Children Alari and human alike ran through a courtyard lined with shared language signs and artificial trees, coated to bloom with dual pigments. Beside him stood Silari, her gaze turned skyward. Her presence was quieter here, less ceremonial, more human. She still carried the weight of her station, but now she also carried the freedom of choice. Their quarters were modest. Their days were filled with task forces, cultural initiatives, and small skirmishes of misunderstanding. But they no longer operated from the edge of survival. They operated from the foundation they had built together. The stars overhead shimmered without boundary. He asked her if they looked different from here. She said no. They were the same stars. Just a new perspective. He nodded his arm, encircling her waist as she leaned against him. The quiet between them was no longer tension. It was peace. Earned. Shared. Below, diplomats mingled. Agreements unfolded. Some still objected, some still whispered. But none could deny the truth they now represented, not in words, not in policy, but in presence. Their connection, once considered violation, now stood as precedent. They had broken rules. They had bled, endured, chosen. And now at the end of it all, they stood side by side, not as anomaly, not as scandal, but as proof. Peace could be written in law, but it could only be lived in trust. In a galaxy still torn by fear and memory, it takes more than treaties to hold peace together. It takes individuals willing to risk everything, not just their lives, but their convictions, their pasts, their futures, for something greater than orders. For trust, for love, for the possibility that across species, across stars, across every line drawn by old hands, something new can still begin. Their story is no longer just theirs. It's the beginning of a different legacy. One born not in silence but in defiance, not in war but in choice, and not in survival but in unity. If you've followed the journey this far, thank you. To support more stories like this, stories that blend science fiction with deep emotion, character-driven worlds, and complex bonds, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every view, every subscription helps us continue building these new universes together. See you in the next story.